Good day. Thank you all for being here. I'm Fred Valdez, and I am honored, pleased to be presenting today. I'm going to be, as the title will say, I am speaking on Belize and what we believe to be the earliest Maya. I first want to thank and congratulate the organizing committee of this first Belize Culture Symposium. It's wonderful to see, and obviously, I think already successful. I also want to thank Amanda Adam for a lot of technical assistance in terms of this recording and so forth. The idea of the earliest Maya has been around for many, many decades. And people have often wondered about who are the earliest Maya, what did they look like, and so forth. This, I hope, will add some information. Hope not confuse too much. But I'm going to discuss from the earliest peoples in Belize, those that came through, into those who then established or began horticulture, the cultivating of crops in essence, and how the Maya perhaps are directly involved into that whole process. My focus is on northern Belize, an area specifically more northeast Belize, where Colha and Cobweb Swamp, or Rancho as it's known on the old Northern Highway, is located. And that will be the sort of center of where a lot of information comes. It happens to be a location where we get early materials that are considered to be pre-Maya, as well as some of the earliest Maya materials. So a brief chronology, there are in places sort of pre-Paleo-Indian or the earliest Paleo-Indian periods that go back perhaps 20 to 22,000. These dates vary quite a bit, depends on who you speak with, et cetera. And Belize has some of this material according to early research by Richard S. or Scotty McNeish. So that's an aspect that is there. The Paleo-Indian part, particularly what's known as Clovis culture, is clearly represented in Belize and throughout the New World. So Belize was a significant player among the earliest Maya and so forth, or earliest inhabitants, sorry. Following the Paleo-Indian period is this Archaic component. The Archaic peoples were hunter-gatherers early on, but by 3400 BC, we know that at least by that point, horticulture, the cultivating or the taking care of crops, the processing of certain crops, domestication in essence is already in play. And by 2000 BC, in some places to 1000 BC, as happens to be the case across much of the Maya lowlands, by 1000 BC, we see settled villages and pottery producers and people that we would call the Maya. And that's that pre-classic or formative period. Here's an example of the kinds of things that the Paleo-Indian Clovis peoples would have had with them. The taller stem point here, the taller lanceolate point here has this flute at the bottom, and that's to allow for a wooden haft so it doesn't break the wooden component part. A here in this illustration is a fluted point. There's that chunk that's missing from the bottom, has been intentionally removed. It helps to thin the base to be able to haft that onto a piece of wood. Or a spear, for example. This particular point, a Clovis point, Clovis-related point, comes from northwest Belize near the village of August Pine Ridge in the Orange Walk district. Incredibly important point. Late in the Paleo-Indian period and into that Archaic that I mentioned earlier are these kinds of points that have these stems and barbs. And this is an Archaic point known as the low point. I'll come back to that in a few slides later. Lots of these points are used on the ends of spears, as is shown here. And a particular tool is developed called the atlatl. And the atlatl is this stick of sorts. It can be made of bone, can be made of wood. It has a hook at one end, and that's to capture the spear at this far end. And it's, as you see in this figure in the lower right, becomes an extension of the arm. And this is what allows hunters to throw the spear at a greater distance with greater force and much more accuracy. Really important for taking down large animals. So the Paleo-Indians are known for the large animals, mastodon, mammoth, and so forth. And that changes as climate changes, as the ice starts to melt, and we get the modern world as we know it today. So here's where some of the earliest sites in Mesoamerica happen to be. Belize certainly has some of these earliest phases that go back perhaps into that pre-Clovis period. And it is definitely has strong representation for that Paleo-Indian period. Here's what some of those Paleo-Indians might have been up to, depends on where they were and the area, et cetera. But the notion that these large mammoths, mastodons, so forth, were taken down in boggy areas where they couldn't move around so fast. It was easier to deal with them. And those large animals provide lots of great resources. Skins for clothing, for shelter, bone that can be used in various ways. The upper right, this individual about to break a large bone open, perhaps to extract the marrow, which is high in protein and so forth. And of course, that's besides the fact that this would produce a lot of meat for these groups that are traveling around to take advantage of. In lower central Mexico, in Tehuacan Valley, this top area is that Paleo-Indian point. These three phases in the middle are the Archaic. So we go from the early Archaic, and you still have these band level societies, which means small autonomous groups, independent groups, family-sized, a few dozen people at the most. And they're moving around from area to area to take advantage of resources, et cetera. By that last phase of the Archaic, 3400 BC, that becomes the important date. This is where we start to see, in this case, they're saying they see evidence for pit houses. We start to see evidence for possible platforms that are constructed in northern Belize near Colha and so forth. And this is where we start to get some things that we now identify as crops. Here's a chronology in terms of the points, the artifacts that they have, Paleo-Indian points below, but you see, you start to see these stemmed points with these barbs, like I mentioned, for that low point that go up during this Archaic period. And there's that example again. And you notice the flaking, the technology part of it is very similar along the edges as it is to the Paleo point. But these are points that then extend into that Archaic period and help people to adapt to a new environment that's coming about. Along the way into that Archaic period, we start to get these kinds of tools that are called constricted unifaces. Constricted because they're constricted at the center part here, probably for hafting, a way to put a wooden thing around it to use, perhaps to shave down trees, to clean out some parts of trees, also used for agricultural purposes. The other side is flat. That's the uniface. They're worked on one side, they're worked on one face, chipped on one face, plain on the other. This is from a more northern area. We don't know that this would have applied directly to Belize, but these early hunters and gatherers moving about from place to place probably lived in simple structures like this, whether it's made of straw, of grasses, of palm fronds, and so forth, just to protect from the local environment, but would move about in these small groups, building nets and baskets and so forth. We also know from other areas across Mesoamerica and to the north of rock art. And this comes into play because we don't get this kind of preservation in Belize, but clearly these ideas, the symbolism and so forth was there and in place during the Archaic period. Some of the kinds of crops that come up early on include avocado, chili peppers, cotton, corn, and these were from the Archaic peoples, from the Archaic periods, especially that 3400 BC period at least, and then coming forward. Manos and metates, or pestles and mortars. We see the mano metate here, where most of us are familiar with these as tools. These are used to process the different plants and things that are made available. And not all plants are for food. Not everything is food. There's cotton and there's other materials that are used to make nets, to make baskets, to make mats, to make sandals. All of these things becoming important. But we tend to focus on the foods and the domestication of corn. We see these smaller cobs at the top on the left, or on the left on the lower illustration. Cobs that are very small at first, and into the Preclassic and into the Maya period then become these larger cobs, sort of similar to the kind of corn that we expect and see today. Kinds of tools that were used in the past, but we don't have evidence for today, or not much evidence for, unless they're in a rock shelter or caved and preserved, were things made of wood and of bone. And those items, where they are preserved in those locations and places where we do see them, inform us about what the other archaic peoples in places like Colha and other spots in Belize would have been using, because those have now decayed due to the tropical environment. So in my estimation, a number of us who look at some of these concerns, we believe that the people who were exploiting the chert, the flint, for example, in northern Belize, the other environmental resources and plants and so forth, are the same folks that later become the Maya. And excuse me, and unfortunately, we don't identify them as Maya, as I said before, until around 1000 BC, give or take a couple of centuries. But at about 1000 BC, because of the permanent villages producing pottery and so forth. But the reality is, lots of these indications of who they are were there before this particular time period. So here are early important sites in early Mesoamerica. For Belize, I have Colha and Colha. I'll show some slides from that particular area that relate. When we get at Colha, we hit these floors with the spattering of charcoal in them and that glittery stuff. Those are fragments of shell beads that were being made. And the Maya were using these little drills, these chert drills, to make those particular beads. We also happen to have found in one location, because it was preserved, bone beads, these little anthropomorphic beads that are strung together. This is the excavations from Colha, and where we see these alignments of what look like rocks in this illustration. Those are the edges of the houses, of those platforms, and they're shaped and moved around over time as they expand and do other kinds of activities. Here's a photo that shows the same thing, and burials were placed outside of this particular platform that later was expanded. Colha, and I'll come back to this. At Colha, we can get to this middle Preclassic 1000 BC period within about a meter, about 3 feet from the ground surface. At a place like Colha in their plaza, here you see where some of their trenches were placed into that large plaza. These units are incredibly deep, meters and meters deep, because of all of the classic and other buildup over time. At Colha, we're fortunate that we can get to the earliest Maya very quickly, those that we definitely identify as Maya. We also see symbols incised or carved onto pottery, this cross sign or con sign, this sort of feather design, which tells us about not only the designs, but the symbols, perhaps ideology, belief systems that may have been in place. We get ceramic ocarinas or whistles, tells us something about the different kinds of activities that they were up to. Ultimately, though, it's all connected to the Maya Trinity or Mesoamerican triad when it comes to food, all important food for nutrition and subsistence, of corn, beans, and squash. Those are there in that archaic period. Those are already developed, identified, and utilized by the archaic peoples at least by 3400 BC and continues into the present day. So the Maya themselves at 1000 BC, in terms of their tools, in terms of their foods, in terms of how they process things, all of those things are already there. Even some of the symbolism is already there in the archaic period. There isn't any reason to really question, are these archaic folks the Maya? I think the Maya are direct descendants. They grow out of those archaic developments. And we hope to have more information after our next research seasons that will tie into that particular aspect. Thank you very much. And I hope this was helpful and useful.